Energy, it's great, but it's 9:40 and we're going to begin because we begin on time. So welcome. Like I said, it is great to see all of you here today. It's wonderful. As you know, that today we are beginning a three-part series that the Justice and Reconciliation and Justice, I'm going to put that, Reconciliation and Justice Ministry is presenting for us. You can read more about it if you need to on pages 13 and 14 of today's worship bulletin. Today, What is White Christian Nationalism begins our three-part series. And Ron Mulder and Tom Arendshorst are going to be our facilitators today. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning, and welcome to the first of our 3-week series about white Christian nationalism. You're going to hear those words a lot this morning, white Christian nationalism. Through this course, we hope to build on the long history of Hope Church of speaking to important issues in our community and seeking to be a faithful voice. We believe that engaging with challenging issues makes us stronger, makes us thoughtfully look at ourselves and our beliefs and calls us to question, what does God call us to do? We seek an understanding that can equip us to face the harmful impacts of white Christian nationalism and advocate for expressions of Christian faith that help us to build the beloved community given in Christ. How might we undertake a conversation with people in our community, both our church community and in the community at large, who hold white Christian nationalist views? And what might it look like to build a strategy of reconciliation for Hope Church on these issues? Our task today is to gain an understanding of what white Christian nationalism is, how it's grown to be a powerful part of our country's culture, and why we, the community of Hope Church, should be concerned about it. Oops, bumped ahead. Hope Church has a long history of speaking to important issues in our community and our world, to seeking to be a faithful voice that reflects the call of Micah 6:8, to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. How are we to live? And how are we to live in our world? We've reached outside our own walls with commitments of energy and resources to support efforts helping disadvantaged families. We've studied God's Word and have worked in faith to discern God's call, to discern our call in response to people having disabilities, to human-induced climate degradation, to people facing LGBTQ plus discrimination, and to people of color whose rights are violated. And then we've committed ourselves to pursue our call in faithful action. This year, our Justice and Reconciliation Ministry within Hope Church has been working to faithfully discern the church's role in racism in order to equip us to be a community that pursues racial justice as one of our core commitments. Through this anti-racism work, we're becoming increasingly aware of the harmful role that white Christian nationalism is playing in our church and in our general society. Much of the harmful impact of white Christian nationalism acts as a force against racial justice. We believe it's important for Hope Church as a faith community to understand the historic roots and current dynamics of Christian nationalism. This understanding can equip us to face its harmful impacts and to advocate for expressions of Christian faith that help us to build God's beloved community. Ron's going to talk with us about the historical development of white Christian nationalism.
Thank you, Tom.
Wait a minute. This thing.
This movement is not new in American history. And to start our discussion, I'm going to...
Maybe is your mic on?
Is it on?
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Could first talk a bit about the concept of patriotism, because it's very legitimate for people to have a set of beliefs and to put it in a patriotic context, because in a way, that's the way things get done. But what is patriotism? Patriotism is really, in American sense, is an adherence to the American ideals of the Declaration of Independence and in the preamble of the Constitution. Nationalism is more of an adherence to an ideology of one way, shape, or another. One of the books I've read recently by Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry, both theology and sociology professors at Yale, is Taking Back America, which is a common slogan in white Christian nationalism. Philip Gorski defines patriotism as an authentic adherence to American ideals, whereas nationalism is an ideology. William Sloane Coffin, who many of us got to know during our long time ago, our years, and for me in graduate school, and then being involved in anti-Vietnam protests, he describes patriotism something like this: it's used by every nation, makes decisions based upon its present self-interest, and then justifies them on the basis of morality. Very pragmatic. Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney who was gained notoriety in the defending people in the Scopes trial, said patriotism hates injustice in his own country as well as everywhere else. Now, what are the core beliefs of so-called white Christian nationalism? At the center of this is a belief that God's law has dominion over all, including civil government. It tends to relegate, for example, the American Constitution, in many instances, to a secondary position. Also in this notion that the United States is somehow God's nation, almost like the modern-day version of the Israelites going to the land of Canaan to establish God's kingdom, and therefore the U.S. is the most favored nation. And then giving urgency to all of this is the end of time narrative that we got to get rid of evil and get ready to meet our Maker. Now, a lot of this is acceptable and even allowable under the American Constitution. This is considered by those who really believe it to be the only narrative and the exceptional narrative. But many believe that the United States, including myself, I believe the United States is an exceptional nation. What really makes it exceptional? It's not because, as Jonathan Winthrop said back in the Puritans, that this is a city on a hill and we're going to spread God's word throughout the land and get rid of evil. And to even many Puritans, this meant getting rid of Native Americans. Or it's not Southerners who first incorporated the institution of slavery on the basis that, first of all, they were going to heathenize Africans, but later on, when some of them converted to Christianity, then we have to keep them because they're not capable of being free people, and we have to civilize them. So, racism. And this became somewhat incorporated in the whole concept of white Christian nationalism. America is exceptional in that its founding fathers put together a republican form of government over a large territory, the concept of federalism, which was unique in the world and still remains unique. There were a lot of separation of powers. The Bill of Rights included there are a lot of things that are always a work in progress. For example, where does sovereignty really lie? Is it in the national government? Is it the state government? Is it in the local government? Or a lot of us are asking now in Western Michigan, is it in the county government? That's always up for debate. The founders never really totally settled that, even though we had a civil war that defenders of slavery clothed themselves in states' rights to defend slavery, and they lost, although sometimes you wouldn't know it if you read the lost cause literature. This is still under debate. It's a very, very legitimate question. Where does sovereignty really lie? And then you take a look at times of uncertainty, whether it be inequality, economic uncertainty, or war, whatever, or personal uncertainty. Just a lot of these things tend to rear their head. And they're not generally debated in a civil way. They're cast aside as evil, or they cast aside others who believe differently as being evil. For example, the founders never understood or wanted political parties. So if you take a look at the Federalist period, to the Federalists, most of the anti-Federalists were disloyal, and in many cases, vice versa. I can remember reading a quote when I was in graduate school when Thomas Jefferson was elected. One Federalist pastor in Connecticut said, "Lord, give him help because thou knowest he needs it." And he did. We all need it. And then throughout American history, these concepts have raised their head, especially in the 1850s, before the Civil War, when slavery was being defended and states' rights on the one hand, a greater national power, national government on the other hand, and the Republican Party became the party of the North. The Democratic Party had long ago largely become the party of the South. And the party of the South, leading up to the Civil War, had tried to even gag any discussion of slavery, which is certainly, I think we would all agree, is not really democratic. Also in the 1850s, there was an influx of Irish immigrants. They were Caucasian, that was fine, but they were Catholic. And somehow Catholics weren't defined by the predominant religion of the day as being Christian. So you had kind of the inclusion of, at this particular time, white Christian nationalism became Protestant Christian nationalism as well as racist. And then as you move on through American history to the current day, we have a situation where we have economic dislocation, tremendous inequality, and a lot of uncertainty, and culminating probably in violence of one to a greater extent in the January 6th insurrection. And this is really becomes a threat in our belief, and according to our title, it becomes a threat to democracy. So in unpacking this, we are here as Christians to, one, be tolerant and engage in civil conversation. On the other hand, we got to be engaged in saving democracy, and that's the path on which we're taking a look. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. This 3-week series about white Christian nationalism has two broad goals. First, we seek to clarify our beliefs and our understanding of God's call for us around this critical issue. I'm going to back this up. There we are. In our time of racial injustice and the struggle for the soul of the American Christian church. Part of this understanding will involve the ways in which we ourselves may have participated in white Christian nationalism. Part will engage us in perceiving the pseudo-Christian fallacies that underlie white Christian nationalism, and part will be our development of what our faith calls us to do to counter the forces of white Christian nationalism. Our second goal is to set a tone of inquiry, respect, and understanding that will empower us to respectfully engage others who have different, even threatening views. Through recent years, we've all faced hostility against justice responses to which we've committed Hope Church and ourselves. Following our call to speak and act against the injustices of white Christian nationalism will pull us into more and more conversations and encounters that will require us to maintain this kind of tone of inquiry, respect, and understanding when we engage others with different angles on what's going on. The titles of our 3 adult ed sessions about white Christian nationalism are What is White Christian Nationalism, today's topic. Next week, White Christian Nationalism, Racism, and Sexism, What Would Jesus Do?, which will be led by Jane Dickey. And the third week, 2 weeks from now, White Christian Nationalism, Close to Home, the Struggle for the Heart of Democracy, led by Bob Giroux. Now we'd like us all to participate in a brief white Christian nationalism survey. This is not a test and is anonymous, 100% anonymous. So please complete this survey in the next few minutes, and we'll collect these responses and add them up and use those aggregated responses in the next couple of weeks. I've got, if we can pass those out, we've got pens here. Maybe didn't want to pass those down. Pass some of these down. Okay.
Can I help you?
Yeah, thank you. And because we only have so much time this morning, we don't really have time to think very much about these responses, but put down whatever pops into your head as an initial response, and then we'll gather them back up in just a few minutes, about 3 minutes. Okay, thank you. That's too bad. Thank you. Each class in this series will employ part of a video produced by the Public Religion Research Institute and the Brookings Institute to educate us about white Christian nationalism and its corrosive effects. The video explores the demographics, attitudes, and dynamics of white Christian nationalism. At the conclusion of each video section, we'll have time for discussion, and we will in a little bit after we watch this video now. Can you take it away?
Glad to see everyone here in person, and again, so grateful of so many online. Well, it's my job to take you through the main findings of the survey today, and I'm going to do that via this PowerPoint presentation. It's going to be a fairly quick drive through the data. We'll have time to unpack it a little bit later, but I'm thrilled to be here, see all of you in person, so thank you for being here. Without further ado, let me just jump in here. First, just some basics to see what so you know what you're looking at. This survey was conducted at the very end of last year, between November 21st and December 14th. Responses, representative sample of over 6,000 Americans. It's a very large survey. Gives us a fairly small margin of sampling error and ability to break out smaller subgroups with higher confidence. It was made possible through the generous support of the Foundation to Promote Open Society, with additional support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist program at Shelter Rock. So thank you to all of those funders who made this study possible today. All right, so one of the biggest questions in front of us was how to measure this idea of Christian nationalism. And one of the ways that we do that, as we've done with other studies in partnership with Brookings, is to kind of think about this as a kind of composite worldview, and to get not just one question, but a number of questions to help us zero in on a particular orientation toward a topic. So in this case, we use 5 questions here to construct a Christian nationalism scale. And basically the way this works is you ask everyone these questions, you get sort of completely agree, somewhat disagree, completely disagree, and then you score people like 1 through 4, right, for each of those answers. And then you standardize the scores, you add them all up, then standardize them between 0 and 1, and everybody gets a composite score for how they answered all 5 of these questions. They could be high on one, low on another, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the percentage of the American public who agree with each of these questions, right? So ranging from a low of God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. 1 in 5 Americans, 20%, agree with that statement. Ranging down here from the high, 40% of Americans agree with the statement, either completely or somewhat agree with the statement, U.S. law should be based on Christian values. And you can see other questions in between. So we combine all of those questions. So everywhere where you see Christian nationalism, adherence, or other categories, it is based on these 5 questions. So how do those questions then sort Americans? We basically looked at the distribution of the data, and it looks like it sorted Americans into 4 basic categories. These are names that we assigned to these groups, right? So we didn't ask people about these names. We came up with these labels to describe where people fell along that continuum with those 5 questions. So starting at the top, we gave the name of the people who completely or mostly agree with almost all of those statements. Christian nationalism adherents. They basically had a composite score of 0.75 to 1 when we added all those questions together and standardized the scale. One way to think about them is they're just people who overwhelmingly agree or completely agree with all 5 questions. The next group down are sympathizers. These are people who agree, but they are less likely to completely agree with those statements. They had this composite score between 0.5 and 0.74. And then finally, kind of goes down the same way, skeptics, those who disagree, but less likely than the last category to completely disagree, and then rejectors. And this category is actually a little bit different because they completely disagreed with all 5 questions, right? So there were enough people in that category to just have, so they had a score of 0, right? Which meant that they completely disagree with everything in the scale. So where do Americans fall? If you take those categories, this is what the country looks like. On the one hand, in the top category of adherents that almost completely agree with everything in the scale, it's 10% of Americans. there are an additional 19% of Americans who we call Christian nationalism sympathizers. That is, those who lean toward supporting that, but less strongly than adherents do. So basically, it's 3 in 10 Americans, right, who lean into supporting this Christian nationalist view, with only 10% in the top category. So that leaves, the rest of the country kind of leaning the other way. 39%. Nearly 4 in 10 are skeptics, again, mostly disagree, and then we have 29% that completely disagreed with all 5 of those questions. So one way of thinking about this wedge here is that there are basically as many people who completely disagree as there are who either completely agree or somewhat disagree with those 5 statements, and then a plurality of Americans leaning away. Right, it's kind of one way of thinking about this. So 3 in 10 on one side and 6 in 10. It's basically a 2-to-1 ratio between those who lean away from supporting that orientation and those who lean toward supporting Christian nationalism. So that's kind of where the country is as a whole. And I'm going to break it down for you a little bit so you can see how it goes across demographic groups. You'll get a little better idea here. But first, let me get this one orientation question here to kind of give you a sense of how it operates on a basic question about what the nation should look like in terms of religious diversity and pluralism. So we had this question. We had 2 options response could pick from. I would prefer the U.S. to be a nation made up of people belonging to a wide variety of religions, or I would prefer the nation to be primarily made up of people who follow the Christian faith. Now, as a country as a whole, like that same pattern, it's basically a 3-to-1 lean toward the first question. I would prefer the nation to be made up of people belonging to a wide variety of religions. Nearly 3/4 of the country believes that, compared to only about 1/4 who would like to see a primarily Christian nation. But check out what happens across these categories to give you a sense of the orientation here. So there are Christian nationalism adherents, basically mirror images of the public, right? So they're lean completely the opposite way. 3/4 said they'd prefer the nation to be primarily made up of those who follow the Christian faith. Among sympathizers, you'll see they're a little more divided, still lean toward majority, saying they prefer the nation to be made up of the Christian faith. And then here are the other 2 categories here. You can see big differences, right, in terms of what they want, what these different groups want the country to look like. So that's just kind of give you a sense of how strongly they think about religious pluralism in the country here. One other thing we did was the term Christian nationalism, as many of you know, is fairly new in our public kind of vocabulary, and so it's part of the vernacular, but we were wondering about how many people actually know about the term and whether they think about the term, and this turned out actually some pretty interesting data. So the first thing is to say that those who are Christian nationalism adherents are much more likely to view the term favorably, right? So it doesn't have a pejorative ring to those who actually are Christian nationalism adherents. Sympathizers, a little less likely so, and then as you can see down to skeptics and rejectors, very few have a positive association with the term. But here's something fairly interesting, is that a plurality of Americans have not heard of the term, right? So we have a big swath of the country, and even among adherents, 4 in 10 say they don't really know, haven't really heard of the term and don't have an opinion about it. Noticeably here, the people most likely to have heard of the term are the people who oppose it. Right? So the rejectors are the ones who really, only 19% of the rejectors say they haven't heard of the term. But here's the other side of it. You can see here people who say they have either a mostly unfavorable or a very unfavorable view of the term. And you can see the rejectors down here, 71%, very unfavorable view of the term. But among adherents, right, it's very clear that those who know about the term overwhelmingly have a positive association with it. So who are Christian nationalism adherents? I'm kind of walking through some demographics here. One of the more interesting things here is how does this break along religious lines? I'm going to put up just the first half, the adherents and the sympathizers here. And the first thing to say is that the top one here, white evangelical Protestants, really do stand alone. There's no other religious group in the country that's anywhere near. This is basically 2/3 of white evangelicals who are either in the adherent category or the sympathizer category. This group, other Protestants of color, is an interesting one too. It doesn't actually show up on most surveys because this is only 3% of the population, right? So the reason why we have it here is because we have a very large survey. We're actually able to break this group out. It is a kind of mixed group. It consists of Asian American and Pacific Islander Protestants. Mixed race Protestants are those who are of a racial or ethnic identity other than black are Latino, right? And so it is a mixed group. It does tend to lean Republican and lean conservative. So that's one of the reasons why you see it up there, really in the neighborhood of Latino Protestants. Latino Protestants also, you see the real difference between Latino Protestants and Latino Catholics here on the chart. That really goes toward their voting patterns. Latino Protestants tend to lean toward voting for Trump. Latino Catholics lean toward voting for Democratic presidential candidates very consistently over the last few years. And then we'll talk more about this, there is one Democratic-leaning constituency that's up there around 4 and 10, and that is Black Protestants, right, who tend to score higher than other kind of Democratic-leaning constituencies. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just kind of flag that here. And then clearly those who are non-Christian religious traditions, Jewish Americans, and the religiously unaffiliated, very, very few, right, in the Christian nationalism cohort. And just here's the other side, just so you can see it. But among white evangelical Protestants, it really is only about a third who are either skeptics or rejectors. That group stinks out more than any other group. One other question that often comes up is like whether people who claim to be Christian nationalists are really just nationalists, right? And whether they really are religious, or whether they're just Christian in name only is the term that gets thrown out a lot of times. What we found is, in fact, that religious attendance is positively correlated with belief in Christian nationalism views, right? So the more likely you are to attend church, the more likely you are to hold Christian nationalist views. So it is very connected to churches, not to people who are just sitting it out on Sunday morning. So those who attend once a week or more, basically half of that group is either in the adherent or sympathizer category. As you go down to less frequent religious attendance, you see the less likelihood of being either a Christian nationalism adherent or a sympathizer. Here's the other side, just so you can see that as well. So I think that's an important kind of contribution to the study as well. Here's one other thing, is that we found that evangelical identity is actually operative not just in white circles, right, but it is operative in African American and Hispanic circles as well. So, for example, here is among whites, those who identify as evangelical or born again are basically about 5 times as likely to be an adherent than those who are Christian but not evangelical, right? So that's the difference that an evangelical identity makes among whites here. And you see a very similar thing among Hispanic Americans. Those who identify as evangelical or born again, much more likely to be adherents than those who are Christian but do not identify as evangelical, and a similar thing among African Americans as well. The factor, is here somewhere between a factor of 5 and 6 that evangelical identity makes, even within different racial or ethnic groups, and the likelihood of being an adherent. And here is partisanship as well. There is, sometimes in political science circles, you will hear the term asymmetric polarization, right? So we know that we're polarized, right? But the asymmetry of it, right, is important. And here we really see this, right? We've got a majority of Republicans, 54%, in either the Christian nationalism adherent or the sympathizer category. Independents way down at 23, Democrats at 15. Just to kind of pause here for a moment, if we take the religious and the political thing together, what we see is the country, right, 2-to-1 leaning against these ideas of Christian nationalism, but one religious group, 2/3 of white evangelicals leaning toward it, and one political party, Republicans, leaning toward it. So that's kind of the kind of power picture that we're seeing in terms of what these numbers mean here. One of the things that is playing a big role in this and driving this is media consumption. So who people most trust. And the way we ask this question is, who do you most trust to give you accurate information about current events in politics? And we give a whole range of television news sources here. This first category, far right news, are outlets like One American News, Newsmax, those kinds of they're newer media outlets on television. But you can see the difference that these make here, right, and driving adherence to Christian nationalism. Those who trust those more far-right news outlets overwhelmingly, so 8 and 10, right, are in one of these top 2 categories. Fox News continues to play a big role there. They've got a bigger following than the other far-right news, but 54% looks about like the Republican number here, are either in the adherents or sympathizers category. Those who say they do not trust any television news sources are kind of lower, and those who trust basically any other mainstream news, sort of broadcast news, CNN, et cetera, are down here about a quarter in those categories. And then here's the other side. And you really see the difference between these top two and really anything else here. So it is this kind of these media centers driving this worldview as well. I'm going to show you some things about demographics here. One interesting thing is there really aren't that many gender differences here in likelihood of being a Christian nationalism adherent or Christian nationalism sympathizer. They look very, very similar. There are some age differences that you'll see here, and the break is basically under 50, over 50. That's where we see the biggest breaks. They're not huge, but they are kind of linear, and with a big jump between over 50. Those older, more likely to be Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. Education, very similar thing. A break between college, 4-year college degree or more, and those with some college or less. Here you can see, if you look at the rejectors too, you can kind of see those with a 4-year college degree basically twice as likely as those with a high school or less degree to be Christian nationalism rejectors. And here we saw less differences by race than we really thought we might see. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. We saw a hint of that in the black Protestant numbers and the religion slide. But basically the numbers between all white Americans, all black Americans look very, very similar, right? There's some small differences here, but not big ones here. And I'm going to come back to the role that whiteness plays in a moment. So we also were interested in this survey in thinking about how does Christian nationalist views correlate with other kinds of ideologies that have been circulating, particularly on the political right. So we're going to ask about a number of these and show you the correlations here so that, what basically is that Christian nationalist views don't sit in a vacuum. They're intersecting with a number of other sets of views. So here are a number of views that have to do with kind of denials of structural racism in the country. And in each of these, you'll see that we have all Americans as the top one and Christian nationalism adherents in the second one. And we've scaled them all the same direction so you can kind of see it. So some are agree, some are disagree, depending on which direction the question leaned. So the first one, just to give you an example, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. So this is the number of people who disagree with that statement. In other words, deny that anything in the past has anything to do with upward mobility or opportunities for African Americans today. Among all Americans, 45% disagree with that statement, but among Christian nationalism adherents, 70% disagree with that statement, right? So big jump here, so positive correlation, and you can see that across all the rest of these questions. I won't read them all, but you basically see this 20, 30-point jump among Christian nationalism adherents. And here I do want to show you across the next few slides the difference that sort of white identity makes within Christian nationalism, right, here. And you'll basically see these numbers just tick up one more click among those who are Christian nationalism adherents and who are white. Basically at least another 10 points that they come up the scale. So in that one we were looking at here, 83% of Christian nationalism adherents who are white disagree with that statement about structural racism. And then look at Christian nationalism adherents of color on this, right? Really different here. So like again, the first one, Christian nationalism adherents of color look like the general population. Only 46% disagree with that statement. And you can see these gaps, 20, 30, even 40, almost 40 points on the first one. So even within kind of Christian nationalism adherents, kind of whiteness tends to have its own kind of vector of operation here. Here is one about anti-immigrant views. Very similar. These are the number of Americans. For example, I'll do the bottom one this time as an example. Immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Essentially, a survey version of kind of so-called replacement theory that you kind of heard kind of bouncing around conservative media. Only 30%, 32% of Americans agree with that statement, but 71% of Christian nationalism adherents agree with that statement, right? And if you look at those who are white, it ticks up another 10 points, right? Christian nationalism adherents who are white, much more likely to hold this kind of anti-immigrant view, and Christian nationalism adherents of color, higher than the general population, but nearly 30 points different than those who are white among Christian nationalism. Another one around anti-Muslim views. I have a couple of questions here. The values of Islam are at odds with American values and way of life. That question was on a scale that says, do you think that this describes the situation in the U.S. today, completely or somewhat? are those who we've graphed, and then we should prevent people from some majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S. These are people who agree. Again, the general population, take the bottom one, prevent people from entering the U.S. 29% of the public, but 67% of Christian nationalism adherents agree with that statement. And then if we look at numbers who are white, again, it ticks up a little bit, not quite as much as it did in the other questions. And you can see this gap between Christian nationalism adherents who are white and those who are not white. So that's the pattern really on anti-Muslim views, anti-immigrant views, and attitudes around racism with regard to African Americans. The view gets a little more complex when we get to anti-Semitism. So we have a number of questions here that are around kind of attitudes about Jewish Americans, and you can see again already the gap between all Americans and the Christian nationalism adherents here. That gap is there, but look what happens when we look at white, the Christian nationalism adherents who are white, basically look at that average for Christian nationalism overall, and we see in a couple of places actually Christian nationalism adherents of color actually scoring a little bit higher on these attitudes that kind of are correlated around anti-Semitism, particularly around Jewish people sticking together more than other Americans, and this idea that American Christians love Israel more than most American Jews do. So some complexity there in terms of race among Christian nationalism adherents. And then finally, the other place that we saw is that there's a high correlation between holding traditional patriarchal gender roles and adherence to Christian nationalism as well. So here, again, a number of statements here. For society as a whole become too soft and feminine, for example. 38% of the country agrees with that, but 66% of Christian nationalist adherents agree with that. And then you could look at the numbers of white and non-white. Here again, the differences aren't quite as pronounced. And on a couple, for example, in a truly Christian family, the husband is the head of the household and his wife submits to his leadership. We actually have Christian nationalism adherents of color scoring slightly higher on that measure than we do. But overall, again, this kind of idea of patriarchal gender roles is something highly correlated with Christian nationalism as well. So we've said a little bit about whiteness in those, but two other places to kind of think about this. We had a standalone question that was not part of the scale that really tried to put the idea of kind of Eurocentric Christianity right heart and center of the question. So this question says, God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world. So we've got kind of white Christianity built into the question here. Among all Americans, you'll see there's about 3 in 10 Americans agree with that statement. And then you can see it's highly stratified by Christian nationalism views. So Christian nationalism adherents, 83% of Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers kind of agree with that statement. You can see it kind of going down here as you go down the scale toward rejectors as well. And here's the rest of the other side of that who mostly agree and mostly disagree. But again, this with whiteness kind of built into it, you can see still highly correlated by Christian nationalism. The other thing the survey did to try to test out, because one of the challenges with the survey is getting people to tell you things that are sensitive, right? People survey respondents, even if we kind of give them guarantees of anonymity, which we do, these surveys are all online and anonymous, it's still sometimes difficult to get people to tell you the truth about, especially things about racism. So we designed an experiment where we basically we split our sample in half, and because we had a big 6,000 person sample, we had 2 samples of 3,000 people. And we gave one group only the first 3 of these questions and asked, and here's what we did. We said, don't tell us which one of these questions you agree with, just tell us how many you agree with, which gave them an extra level of anonymity, right? They could just say, I agree with 2. I agree with 3 of those statements. So that was one half of the sample. The other half of the sample, we gave all 4 questions. Same thing. Don't tell us how many, or don't tell us which ones, just tell us how many. So I agree with 3. I agree with 4. So what it turns out that what you can do is, because the sample is split, the only way the average number of questions people agree with can be higher on the treatment side is if people picked that last question, right? So it's a kind of indirect way of measuring people being willing to pick something that they might not be willing to tell you directly, right? So it turns out, so that's what we did in the survey, and we were able to estimate the number of people picking that 4th question, right, without telling us directly that they picked it. And it turns out that our estimates are that 17% of Americans picked that question, And it's a pretty strong one, right? The United States is a white Christian nation. I am willing to fight to keep it that way, right? That was the question, right? And we estimate using that survey experiment, 17% of Americans kind of hold that idea. And I just wanted to put up our scale here, our Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizer scale, just so you can see them side by side. It kind of gives us some confidence that we're in the ballpark here with our scale, with that experiment kind of verifying somewhere in the middle of this group the number of people who think this about it's not just a Christian nation, but a white Christian nation, and willing to keep it that way. So finally here, I'm going to wrap up with some questions around violence. And one of the kind of key concerns we saw on January 6th, right, is whether Christian nationalism leads itself to violence and willingness to kill, harm, or maim other or fellow citizens, attack our government institutions here. And so we asked some questions about whether people, when they've had a disagreement, have they done any of the following? Have they pushed, grabbed, or shoved someone? Have they bit or slapped someone? Or have they threatened to use or actually used a gun, knife, or weapon on someone? So not that many Americans have done this, right, thankfully. And you can kind of see the numbers here for all Americans. But it does turn out that among those who are Christian nationalism adherents, the numbers do tick up slightly. More likely to say just in resolving disagreements here. And if you compare that to rejectors, you can see the gap, right? Those on the other opposite end of the spectrum. That's kind of individual experiences or tendencies toward violence. What about political violence? So we've been asking this question for a while. This question about whether, so it reads, because things have gotten so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. Here is all Americans. 16% of the country agrees with that statement. But again, among those who are Christian nationalism adherents, that number jumps to 40. It jumps to 40%. Sympathizers is 22, and then you can kind of see it going down. So there is a much higher relationship between attitudes toward political violence as well among Christian nationalism adherents. So on that cheery note, I'm going to kind of wrap the presentation, and I'm going to take my seat. I'll have a little bit more to say in terms of commentary as part of the panel, but thank you for your patience, and with that, let me welcome the panel to join me.
We have lots to talk about and think about. Ron, you want to come up too? From this point, for the rest of our time, we're open for comments and questions, thoughts about the what we've talked about this morning. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and Bob and Judy have microphones, and make your comments and questions as succinct as you can, so everybody would have a chance. But yes.
What about black versus white Christians? Could you name yourself? My name is Ed Ganaway, and I want to know what about black Christians versus white Christians?
In what way versus? I'm not sure I understand.
Who are the Christians?
Oh,
Black versus white.
who are more? Which group are more Christian?
No, who are the Christians?
Yeah, Dad's doing his best
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
But Dad, what I think I'm hearing is Dad wasn't able to discern from all the data in the presentation here.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to process, and I think the concern is what are we trying to say about the articulations here between black and white across the board? Does that make sense, Dad? What are we trying to say here, right?
Whether blacks are Christians or whites are Christians.
Yeah.
I contend that both can be Christians.
Yes, and I appreciate the point that people of all types, people of all socially defined races, everybody can be Christians, and it's not just Christianity doesn't belong to one social or racial subset. Amen.
And one other thing here, thinking about this, you take a look at the 1850s. You take a look at the 1850s versus today. I believe in the polarization of political parties that it certainly was possible for a Democrat in the 1850s who was largely pro-Southerner and therefore more likely to accept slavery. It was possible for that person in his own mind and to be accepted and should be accepted as a Christian. Today, it's possible, I believe, flipping it around, it's possible for a Republican to be a Christian. And it's a belief system, and of course we're challenging ourselves, how does that affect the way we act both individually and in society?
I want to remind you that we are being recorded, so bear that in mind as you ask your questions, make your comments. Just a caveat.
Yeah. Another question or comment? What essential questions does this information raise for you about the effects and nature of white Christian nationalism? You've got to comment.
I'm Steve, and this is more a comment than a question, but I was surprised by the correlation between levels of education and white Christian nationalism. The data indicated that those who espouse white Christian nationalism are generally, let's use that term, less educated. I have not found that necessarily to be true. That may have been a consequence of where I served as pastor, because it's very likely that the next Speaker of the House will be from the adjoining congressional district. But I'm just curious what others have encountered.
Any thoughts in response to that question? One thing that comes to my own mind is we each swim in a little pool, and we're surrounded by people who may not represent the broad swath of the American public, even though there's a range always among the people. That's the only thought I have in response.
I think you need to think about critical thinking skills that people learn in college, liberal arts colleges, different things that necessarily aren't taught in a high school or lower level. It's more memorization. What do you just like rote learning? I think that like essentially leads to that answer. My question though is, you start at the beginning about patriotism definitions and nationalism definitions. Can you kind of go back to that? I just want to make sure I have those clear in my mind in terms of what the difference you have between patriotism and nationalism.
Thank you. Patriotism, to me, as an American citizen of the United States, is a wide adherence to the principles in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and the preamble to the Constitution, a union for the greatest good to the greatest number. And when you take a look at it, I could have easily been to personalize it, a Republican in the 1850s for a lot of reasons, but I love this slogan, free soil, free labor, free men, because it seemed to encapsulate a country that was open to everybody, who was willing to work for it, adhere to a certain set of ideals and the rule of law, and subject a government elected on the basis of majority rule, however restrictively that was defined. An ideology, I believe, is an acceptance of a set of beliefs that is, no matter what the majority believes, there's no, in many cases, no consensus on trying to attempt to reach consensus. And if you can govern with a minority because they believe in this ideology, then that's fine.
I'm just wondering if any attempts have been made yet to further break down evangelicals in terms of congregations or what have you, how they fit into this pattern.
Thanks, Fred. I don't have knowledge about that.
I'm Dan Griswold, and I'm dismayed by the reporting in this survey, which I accept, that attendance at religious services correlates with adherence, either fully or in part, with acceptance of white Christian nationalism. And I'm kind of turning over in my mind three probably related questions, two that are strongly related, or really one. They're together. Is this a matter of correlation or causation? Do people go to church and then become Christian nationalists, or are they going to church because they are Christian nationalists? And another is more historical, wondering if not, kind of just putting it out there, has there been research into prevailing attitudes throughout the 20th century, in particular among religious Christian figures of a breadth, including mainliners? I would expect that you'd find in the early part of the 20th century more of that, even among mainliners. But those are some things I'm wondering about, and maybe just to turn it back to you, one of you could speak to the causation-correlation question.
I can't speak with any kind of knowledge about causation, correlation, but certainly Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism have been prominent throughout history. I mean, think back to the Ku Klux Klan, an overtly Christian organization. We think back to news programs I remember hearing after World War II when I was a kid, and Billy Graham, who had a lot of positive messages, but certainly would have pulled together nationalism and Christianity and the moral majority of the 80s. I mean, this is a long-running, strong thread running back, back into pre-American Revolution, racist economics and society. So it's a strong current, and it's easy for people to find others to think the same. But I can't answer the question about causation or correlation.
I guess one slight addition to that is that I don't think necessarily white Christian nationalists set out to be a political movement. Even though their adherence to God's law and the Constitution was considered secondary, so separation of church and state kind of went by the way. It became a political movement primarily with in the 1970s and in the 1980s with the moral majority. And now you would have to say that in some respects, although the true believers believe that they are Christian, they have to recognize that they are a political movement. That's how they've defined themselves. And in any political movement, it is you fight for the soul of the voter, and sometimes that hinges on putting coalitions together that are made up of minority coalitions. And I think that the new thing in all of this, more recently, has been money in politics, an expansion of the various 501c3 charitable giving designations to almost give some type of philanthropic status to advocacy groups as opposed to pure philanthropy. And then also you've seen some real similar type of activities in the recruitment of Supreme Court justices. And in many cases, if you're a strong minority group in its sense of beliefs, you can't get a majority of voters, maybe you can get a majority of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, regretfully, I think do we have one more question, or Kathy? It's time for us to bring our discussion to a close. There's so much more to talk about, and I certainly hope that you'll all be back for our coming two sessions next week. Jane Dickey leading us in discerning what would Jesus do, and how white Christian nationalism relates to racism and sexism. And then in 2 weeks, Bob Giroux will leading us in the effects of white Christian nationalism on democracy and racism. We will please drop off your survey things on the table at the back, I'd like to close with just a very brief prayer. Gracious God, guide us in dealing with this information, and help us to gain understanding and to consider these issues with a spirit of inquiry and respect for others. Help us to discern your call and to follow your call in our thoughts and actions. Amen.
Thank you. Yes, our thanks to Tom and Ron today, kicking off this 3-part series, giving us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.